Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the class. Shavua Tov Varach. Hey, we didn't hit the technical difficulties we had last time, so I'm glad we got started a little earlier. For those who want, um, you know, and I wanted to share. I just forgot to share this with one person. I know it's not professional of me to share a middle of this, but I did forget to share with one person my link. So just give me a moment, please bear with me, and I will. Okay. 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 Sorry for the brief interruption. Okay. So we are today continuing on with the topic of Hashgacha Pratit, Hashgacha Pratis. I'm sorry, my pronunciation is more naturally Ashkenazi, and we are learning this book. It's called Shomer Emunim, the Introduction to Kabbalah by Rav Yosef Ergas, with a translation, commentary, and Kabbalah Overview by Avinoam Fraenkel. We are delving into the Kabbalah Overview section. That's what we're concentrating on in this series of classes. And we are up to this section that begins on page 820, but really we're up to page 825 on the topic of Hashgacha, which is God's supervision, God supervising the universe. And we discussed last week a couple of different versions of this. We had discussed that there is the that there's the view that God supervises everything individually down to the finest detail. And then there is the view that, there's that for lower consciousness entities, there's only like a species-wide divine supervision. And there aren't, there isn't a set, the entities are less important than the species as a whole. And he went over that there were various, various views on either, various great rabbis who took either side of the story. For example, Rav Moshe Cordovero takes the opinion that everything down to the finest detail is supervised by God. And it's interesting, on page 824, what's it called? He tells you who falls on which side of the equation. For example, the variable approach, which is the approach that divine supervision, divine providence, is, what's called, there's distinctions of divine providence. If you're a higher level entity, a higher consciousness entity, you get more individualized divine providence. And if you are a lower level entity, let's say a rock, you only get, or plant, or maybe fish, you only get a species-wide divine providence. So he goes through that. It seems that he goes through who has that opinion. And interestingly, but the opinions that I'm familiar with, such as the Baal HaTanya, Menachem Levites, or Chaim Sons, the Minchas Elazar, they all seem to have the absolutist approach. Now, then he had, in our continuation, he said that the Ari HaKadosh had sort of like a blend of the two. where there is a absolutist approach in the for the for the basics of life. But then when you get to the add-ons, extra blessings and this and that, then there was more of a variable approach. My approach tends to be, personally, and I mentioned this last week, is as such. I believe in the absoluteness approach. That God, that every what he's calling the absolute approach. In other words, God knows and supervises every detail. The question is whether the supervision is revealed. So I believe when it comes the higher level, the in consciousness, the entity, the more it's revealed. So divine providence, divine supervision will be more revealed, let's say, in a human than would be in a rock. It will be more revealed in the land of Israel, which is a place of higher consciousness. It's an energy vortex versus, let's say, the United States. Although there are levels of it that are revealed here, but it's not to the extent as over there. The higher the consciousness, the more it's revealed. That's my personal opinion. Revelation does not take away from the fact that whether something is or isn't. I'm saying it's just more revealed there, but it's equal all over. Okay, so we are. So now we're in the middle of discussing the Arizal's approach, which holds that there is more of an absolute fundamental foundational divine supervision that everything has individually detailed in order to maintain reality. Otherwise the world won't exist. Versus what our good deeds can bring down further, and that's more individualized. So let's take a look over there. Bottom paragraph of page 825. To relate this teaching from the Arizal, it is important to appreciate that the term use of Hashefa, meaning bestowal, Ha'ora, meaning enlightenment, and Hashgacha, meaning divine providence, are all essentially referring to the same thing. What it means is the level of manifestation of the infinite light in the worlds within the environment created by the sphere of Malchut. So you could think of the sphere of Malchut as you might say, a framework in which all the worlds exist. Now, what we're talking specifically over here is the Malchut of Olam Atzilut, of the world of emanations. So the last sphere of the world of emanations is the framework in which all the other worlds exist, the low worlds, the world of Atzilut, remember, is the world of emanations. Then you have after that the world of Bria, which is the world of creations. And after that, the world of Yetzira. And then after that, the world of Asiya. So, this is where he's talking. This is where it applies in the framework of what's contained within the sphere of Malchut. So this manifestation provides the basic existence of absolutely everything that is contained within a world created within the Malchut environment. As we saw earlier, this basic existence is created by applying a level of shefa, meaning abundant flow, ha'or, and illumination, via the yosher, the ruach level of the ha'ora of the igulim, or the rishim of the igulim. We're going to unpack it. Don't get lost on the words yet. Okay, which are underlying components of that world. So what's going on over here is, so Cindy, we're on the top of page 826. We had started on 825. You're welcome. Thank you for coming. I didn't expect you to come in person.
I almost didn't because I'm now interrupting everybody, so I apologize.
No, it's all good. It's all good. Listen,
I usually join when I'm like, darn, I missed it by 5 minutes. Okay, I'll do it from home.
Okay.
But I'm going to be here.
Okay. So there's very tight language in this, and very dense language here. Um, so we discussed that different kinds of divine providence, different views of divine providence. Now we're unpacking the Arizal's view of it, and the Rav Yitzhak Luria's view of it is that it actually functions on two levels. There's like there's a fundamental foundational level to keep the universes going that's irrespective of human deeds, and then there's one can add to divine supervision through the Torah mitzvot u'masim tovim. So
And what about for non-Jews?
well, that's why they depend on us to do Torah mitzvot masim tovim. That's how they get blessed.
Okay.
That's why they're upset with us if we don't live by the Torah, because they can't get what's theirs.
I don't think they're upset about whether we keep Torah.
Okay.
But
well, the deeper soul is.
Okay, but what
the
about
deeper soul is?
But what about the fact that they have their own relationship with God as a part of what Jewish
That's,
thinking is?
They do have their own relationship with God.
So don't they have their blessing for their relationship with God?
They do, but it's a but everything is levels and levels.
Okay.
So but they do have their own blessing and relationship with God, no question about that. So but the world as a whole really depends on the Jewish people doing the Torah. The blessings to the nations come through the Jews living by the Torah. I mean, it says, it's a Gemara that says that at the time when we had the Holy Temple, if the nations of the world were aware of how the 70 bulls that were sacrificed in the temple on Sukkot brought them blessings, they would have stationed guards around the temple to keep it intact and to make sure that it's functioning properly. Because they got blessed from it. So, okay, so we'll just okay, so we'll start with on top of 826. As we saw earlier, this basic existence is created by applying the level of divine abundance, illumination, the linear sphirot, this and which contains ruach, the spirit, to the levels of divine abundance and illumination of the igulim, of the spherical sphirot, the afterglow, and the nefesh level, which are the underlying components, elements of that world. Okay, so let me unpack this. Okay, so what he's basically saying, it's my understanding what he's saying is that the absolute view, the view that the maintenance level, we're not talking about the additions, talking about the maintenance level, is coming through the normative flow, that the linear sphirot impregnate the spherical sphirot, and that's how life goes. It's the flow from the infinite light through the linear sphirot, filling and impregnating the spherical sphirot with divine light, and this repeats on every world level. So it is in the world of emanations, Atzilut. It's in the world of creations, Bria. It's in the world of formations, Yetzira, and it's in the world of action, Asiya. So that's the simple way to understand the sentence. This application of abundance of linear sphero flow reconfigures the flow of the spherical sphero to create all the partsufim and spiritual entities that exist in that world environment. So what's happening is that the linear sphirot is acting on the spherical sphirot, and it's reconfiguring the structures that exist in that particular world as a result. It's adding consciousness to it. The overall view level of abundant flow and divine illumination and divine supervision that generates the nefesh and ruach of everything within that world's existence is static and absolute. So, in other words, what he's saying is, it's like a stream. It keeps everything as is. It is not withdrawn even if human actions are undeserving. So, that basic flow, the stream of divine electricity that comes in this kind of way is what's called independent of human action, because it creates the background, it creates the foundation, and if the foundation could be ruined by human action, then forget it, everything is done with. By the way, simply Cindy, remember it says in the book of Lech Lecha, in the Parsha Lech Lecha, the book of Genesis says, and all the nations of the world will be blessed through you, and you'll be a light to the nations. It says in Isaiah, right? You'll be a kingdom of priests, a holy people. It says, I think it's probably in Exodus. So if you take a look at these verses, it means that the Jewish people are responsible for blessing humanity, to bring the blessings to humanity.
Okay, or other things too, or working with humanity too.
Yeah, that goes hand in hand.
Right. I see it as working with humanity to make the world a better place.
Yeah. It's not a contradiction. It's the same. It's part of the same picture. Okay, back to the text. Separate to that, positive human action merits additional divine abundance, illumination, divine supervision to be bestowed. This, in effect, is the potential bestowal of higher levels of existence, which before we said was nefesh and ruach, right? Now, there's a potential for the soul of neshama chaya yechida to complete that world parts of that ultimately becomes integrated with the higher source world parts of. So what's happening is that the basic flow is just brings a nefesh and a ruach level. These are, by the way, names for the levels of the soul, but in Kabbalah, they are also names of divine lights, levels of divine light. So let's discuss this again briefly. The 5 levels of the soul, right? Going from lowest to highest, there's nefesh, ruach, neshama, chayi, yechida. Nefesh, as we experience as human beings, is a biological soul, basic it animates the biological side of life. The ruach is about growth. It's in the human being, we experience it as our psychological side. In fact, it's brought down from the Vilna Gaon that when you're talking to a person, the main part of the soul that we experience as our soul is our ruach. Of these 5 levels, the main soul is the ruach. When you're talking to a person, you're talking to their ruach mainly. Then above that, you have a neshama. Neshama. So ruach translates literally in English as spirit. Neshama is what literally translates as soul. And neshama is already reaching beyond in order to connect to higher lights, it's already moving to higher concepts and understandings. And we call it, roughly speaking, it corresponds to the intellectual side of the human being, the part that the left brain, the part of the mind that is analytical and all that. Then you have above that you have chaya. Chaya roughly corresponds to the kind of thing that's in the right hemisphere of the brain. Chaya literally means life, plain simple. It's core life. And then you have yechida, which means uniqueness. That roughly corresponds with the volition in the human being, the drive, the core drive that gives the human being his or her overall sense of direction in life.
The fourth one?
Chaya.
Yeah, when you call it,
it's like an
life,
intuitive, yeah.
How is that different than the basic biological life?
Okay, so it's not physical; it's more intuitive.
Would it be more related to our unconsciousness?
Yeah.
Connected to it somehow?
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, okay. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's so the given so the
subconscious, I meant to say.
Yeah. Well, I think subconscious, unconscious seem to be used interchangeably,
depending what. Is like when you're knocked out and you're not aware.
Yeah, but the unconscious self. I mean, because yes. Depends. If you're talking Freud, it's subconscious. If you're talking Jung, it's unconscious.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah. That's how I understand it, at least. Okay. So we have these levels of the soul, but in Kabbalah they're not just levels of they're not just levels of the soul. These are names for different levels of spiritual light. Happens to be our soul is a spiritual light, so that's why they also get those names. So the universes go up in consciousness if through our actions. Serving God, we could bring the universes up levels, and when they're brought up levels, they grow, and before they just embodied nefesh and ruach, nefesh from the spherical sfirot, and ruach from the linear sfirot. Now they start to embody neshama, and if they get higher, chaya. They get higher yechida, and he's saying that this connects them to the worlds, the universes, to the worlds above them. Remember, we're microcosms, so we're little samplings of the universe. Our souls are, just parts of this divine light. The universes themselves grow in consciousness. Welcome, Oron. Welcome. So. We'll play a little musical chairs. Here you got a chair, Oron. Okay. So, the universes themselves, they grow in consciousness. They grow in their spiritual level. This is we look at our universe and we tend to think of it as as something static, but the universe is growing in its consciousness. And not only that, its own growth in consciousness is dependent on the growth of consciousness of universes that are beyond it, spiritual universes beyond it. We're like the tail of the creature, all the universe going up. So because we're the tail end, we get lifted up too. I mean, when a lion moves through the savannah, as it moves, its tail moves also. Mm-hmm. So we have that going on. Okay, so this additional bestowal is, however, variable. And after it has been merited, any human negative action will cause it to correspondingly diminish. But it will never diminish below the baseline, of divine flow, illumination, and supervision required for basic existence. So So the Arizal, he has an aspect of the of this divine supervision. It's absolutist. In other words, it's baseline, it's basic, it's foundational. And then an aspect that's an add-on, and the add-on that can come and go as based on how human beings behave. Therefore, at any one time, there's a level of divine flow of abundance, illumination, and divine supervision. This level is always relative. The higher the level, the more relative linear sphirot and repair, and the less relative spherical sphirot and shattered and broken sphirot. So what he's telling you is that that on the higher levels, as the whole thing gets pulled up, the whole system of divine supervision gets pulled up. The proportion of where it's coming from changes. So a smaller proportion, even if it's an unchanging proportion, will come from the spherical sphirot, and greater proportion will come from the linear sphirot as it unites with the higher levels of neshama, chaya, and yechida. The lower the level, the more the lower the level. This now the contrast, the flip side we just said. The lower the level, the more relative will the spherical sphere. In other words, you have a greater proportion of the divine flow coming from the spherical sphirot and the shattered sphirot. It'll be less proportion of linear sphirot and of repaired sphirot. So in other words, it's it's like I just said. It's a question of proportion. You have. Let's look at it mathematically for a moment. Okay, the baseline are two levels, nefesh and ruach, right? Those are the two level baseline, absolute, full on divine supervision on those two levels. You start adding other levels. Let's say we go all the way to bring in the light of Yechida into the universe, its relative level of Yechida. So now, what's linear and connected to those higher levels, because the linear sphere connect more directly to those higher levels, you're going to have a greater proportion. Now have 4/5 of linear sphirot and of tikkun, of repair, and only 1/5 of the baseline divine supervision. Whereas the flip side would be, well, we're back to where we were. So let's say we have only ruach and nefesh now. So now it's 50-50. I don't think it means that the spherical sphirot involvement diminishes. I think it's just that they get out proportioned by the higher levels that are being brought in.
Mm-hmm.
Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. However, the level is entirely determined by human action. However, there is a minimum level of basic existence of the lowest relative level of the linear sphirot and the highest relative level of the spherical sphirot that is irrespective of human action. This level is the basic existence that is always bestowed. Okay, so to recap, the Rizal system has two kinds of divine supervision.
Mm-hmm.
One kind is basic, in order to keep the universes going. So that, and then the other kind is an add-on, and based on our deeds, we're capable of bringing that add-on to bear.
To bear means to act.
To act, to make that add-on active.
Mm-hmm.
And so the basic levels are the ruach and nefesh. That's basic cosmic male female, and that's that's nature as it goes, as it flows.
Mm-hmm.
Then and of course, nature is not simply nature. Nature, of course, includes divine supervision, divine involvement. God is involved with every detail, and God, then you have add-ons which we can add on based on our deeds. We can add on divine supervision. Divine supervision itself is a light.
Mm-hmm.
It's not simply, oh yeah, God's looking at it. It's a light. I'll give you. There's actually something beautiful in this past week's Torah portion, which connects with this. There's a verse that says that the eyes of God are on the land of Israel from the beginning of the year to the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's in Torah portion of Akev. So the Alter Rebbe asks the following question: why don't you just say the eyes of God are on Israel all the time? All the time.
Yeah.
Tamid.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of Meireshus Hashana or Achris Hashana, say Tamid all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So because isn't the beginning of the one year the end of the previous year, and vice versa, the end of why is it mentioned in terms of quanta of years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so so Alter Rebbe says that because every year in Rosh Hashanah there's an entirely new flow of divine supervision that's coming down.
Mm-hmm.
The eyes of God are divine supervision,
Mm-hmm.
and right, it's a light, it's a spiritual light, and there's a new spiritual light of divine supervision that comes down every year on Rosh Hashanah.
Which depends on our deeds, or
yeah, it depends on our deeds. Yeah, of course. And that's why we say tshuva, tzedakah, tefillah, ma'avir nesraya gezerah, right?
Mm-hmm.
We say, returning to God, prayer, and donating alms removes the evil decree, the harmful decrees. Why? Because it depends on our deeds. This is why it's the time of doing tshuva, time of returning to God. We start with Elul. We prepare for that. There's a new light of divine supervision coming down. And then from the land of Israel, from there, the Alter Rebbe continues that the divine supervision spreads out through the rest of the lands of the world. But the peak point of it, the point where it makes contact with the world, is our world is in the land of Israel.
Same as when there was the temple.
Right. That doesn't change. Because the place is holy. You can't, regardless of whether the temple is present or not. So, continuing on page 826, closer to the bottom of the page after the first long paragraph. From the Arizal's teachings, we can understand the following key points about divine providence. We can also define terms that will be useful in our subsequent discussion. There are two distinct levels of divine providence, right? That's what we discussed. The one that's a basic and then one that's an add-on.
Mm-hmm.
The first level is absolute, meaning basic, and causes everything in existence to continuously exist. We call this a general divine providence, hashgacha klalit, that constantly causes the existence of everything in the universe to the minutest detail as it exists within the framework of the sphere of Malchut, of the world of Atzilut, the world of emanations.
from this week until maybe last week we said there
Yeah.
might be different opinion about the rabbis, but
Right.
according to the Arizal, looks like even the fish will be somehow
Right.
providence, right?
Right. There's the individual divine providence even on the fish, right?
Mhm.
Even on the individual fish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even on this table. Okay?
Right. Even on the table. Right. Yeah. The second level is variable and modulated in proportion to the actions of humans and mankind. We call this a specific divine providence. It's called in Hebrew Hashgacha Klalit. It comes as an additional bestowal to be manifest within the Malchut framework, within the framework of the sphere of Malchut of Atzilut. So we have that also going. I mean, I think this is fascinating when you think about it. It's just fascinating. It's like God gave us a portion that's basic, and then He said, "Okay, now you're the co-creator. After this basic level, you have some involvement. Human being has some involvement." Yeah, I wanted to share a story that came along with the Torah I said about the Alter Rebbe about God's eyes being on the land of Israel from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It was probably the late 1800s or so, and there was a Hasidic Rebbe who wanted to move to the land of Israel, for the purposes of connecting to the holiness there, and he made his plans to settle in Jerusalem. But, we know that the port city at that time was Haifa, or was it Jaffa? It was Jaffa, excuse me. Jaffa was Jaffa.
Mm-hmm.
And, those days you didn't have planes, so you came by boat. So now this Hasidic Rebbe was known that every time, he was traveling, he had a spare moment, he'd be studying Torah in order, he wouldn't waste the time. He'd be studying Torah. If he was on a horse-drawn carriage, he'd be there studying. If he was on the boat, he'd be there studying. Of course, we had to deal with people. Then that wasn't time for studying. That was time for dealing with people. But whenever he personally had time, he'd be immersed in studying Torah. Anyways, he disembarks in Jaffa, and then there's a long coach ride from Jaffa to Jerusalem, a few hours at least, I think.
Yeah.
If you're going, especially going by coach,
Yeah.
horse and buggy.
Could take you a day, maybe. I don't know.
Who knows what the road was like then?
Yeah.
Right. Who knows what the road was like, right?
We're going up the hill.
Right. So
Yeah.
he, uncharacteristic of him, they don't see him with studying a book of Torah. They see him gazing outside. He's gazing out the window of the coach, and he continuously gazes with rapt attention. So when they reach Jerusalem, his followers ask him, what was that? I mean, why didn't the Rebbe sit? They asked him very gently and very delicately, why wasn't the Rebbe learning like he usually does? He said, there's a verse in the Torah which says that the eyes of God are in Israel, the land of Israel, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So my eyes should not be on the land of Israel. I have an opportunity to have my eyes on land of Israel. I should not do that.
I'm sure he was learning through that.
Yeah, that was his learning, right? It was, Okay. Top of page 827. Now, this teaching from the Arizal only seems to go part way to explain the difficulties with Shomer Emunim's presentation. It explains. Remember, Shomer Emunim is the main book over here, and it was written by Rav Ergas, and a lot of the basics of Kabbalah are explained in this book. It explains Rav Ergas' sweeping statement. First of all, you need to know that there's no act, small or large, that is by happenstance and without divine providence. In that, this clearly relates to the absolute general divine providence that constantly causes everything to exist. It also explains Rav Ergas's closing statement that everything is dependent on the actions of mankind, and that according to his or her distance or closeness to God, his providence will correspondingly be with the person. In that, this clearly relates to the variable specific divine providence. So, Ergas made two statements in the book that would seem to contradict, but they flow beautifully with what we just learned. The first statement he said is that there's no acts, small or large, that is by happenstance without divine providence. The next he said that everything is dependent on the actions of a human being, and that corresponding according to his or her distance or closeness to God, that will be how he or she will experience God's providence. So the statement A is clearly the general providence. Statement B is the more specific providence as it relates to the person. However, what it doesn't seem to explain is why Rav Ergas talks about a concept of divine providence that applies to groups of entities that exist on all levels of existence, be they inanimate objects, plant life, animal life, or even humans. How do the groups fit in with the Arizal's framework of divine providence? So in other words, it could be a collective divine providence, Okay, divine providence, let's say, on all the marlins, divine providence on all the redwood trees,
Well, we can say the eagles because they were having that problem with their eggs.
Right,
in the
well, divine
70s,
providence on all the eagles, right.
and then they end up surviving. So
Right.
it's
Right.
But where it's come from that there's an angel that hit the grass and
It's
it broke
actually
and-
a Talmud. It says that there's an
Yeah.
angel. Yeah, every blade of grass is an angel that strikes it and says, "Grow." So in other words, everything has a spiritual counterpart. Now, Rizal provides insight into this in a further teaching that has already been discussed in detail. He explains that every lower level of existence, meaning every lower parts of, is in a relative sense like Zerampin and Nukva compared to the level of existence meaning the parts of that is above it. Therefore, every lower level parts of has the inbuilt ability to grow and become a higher level parts of. So remember, Zerampin and Nukva was just the basic level. So you could grow from there. You could grow from the Zerampin embodies Ruach, Nukva embodies Nefesh, and you could grow from there to incorporate Neshama, Chaya, Yechida. So you could grow from there. So let's see where he's going to take this. Okay. Every lower level parts of every lower relative parts of is on the lower relative level that receives a lower level of hashgacha, of divine supervision, is therefore has a higher relative level of shattered tohu and igulim. So in other words, the lower level parts of really is in a state of lower divine supervision. It's relative to the higher parts of. In contrast, the higher relative parts of is on a higher relative level that has a higher relative level of repair and linear sfirot. Tikkun is always tikkun meaning that repair is always associated with a higher level of binding together and unity, whereas shattered, meaning tohu, is always associated with a higher level of separation, isolation. Okay, I'm not going to unpack yet. I want to get to the end of the paragraph. Then we'll unpack. Therefore, existence within a lower parts of represents a relative increased level of a group separate and disparate and individual entities as depicted by increasing levels of shattered tohu and reduction. This contrasts with existence of within higher relative parts of which is in relative terms has more integration and tends towards being more single integrated collective as depicted by increased levels of repair and emergence. Okay. So what he's basically saying is that the higher the level of parts of, the more tikkun, the more repair, the more divine light it contains. And the lower level the parts of, the more it is shattered, the more it partakes of what's broken, the more it's the lower the divine light it contains, the more it's ruled by higher by the spherical sphirot proportionately, as opposed to the linear sphirot and the higher levels that it can attain. That's what he said, which I think is kind of intuitive based on what we were already learning. I think that just flows with what we were already learning. Now let's get to the implication of this. Next paragraph. The implication of this is that divine providence is always applied in a relative context. Remember, I told you that the study of Kabbalah is really a relative study. It's not like, it's different than studying Talmud in that regard. When applied to the lower level parts of the relative level of spherical sphirot, it is always applied in general terms to a relative group of separate entities, even if that group has some commonality. However, when applied to a higher level parts of the relative level of linear sphirot, it is applied to in very specific terms to every last aspect of the integrated, unified whole ecosystem, the larger collective. Okay, so he's trying to say is that divine providence is more loosely applied to lower entities, it's not as integrated, whereas more tightly applied to more integrated entities because they are, to higher entities because they're more tightly integrated. So their details are more integrated into the system. Okay, so
maybe the higher the level, maybe they're more aware of the ashgacha.
Right, right. But he's explaining why that is.
Yeah.
Because they're more of they're a higher level of integrated unity. Remember, we're learning that there is a integrated unity going on. When you have tikkun is integrated unity. So the higher the level of the unified integration, the more the details count and matter. Not only does the whole matter more, but also the details matter more. Okay. The structure of linear spheres is analogously depicted by the integrated whole structure of a human being. Therefore, divine providence, when applied to a human being, will always be analogously applied to every aspect of the human being and the person's ecosystem. In contrast with the disparate groups of underlying components that comprise a human being, including the inanimate, the plant, and life, that relative to the integrated level of the human being are unintegrated and on a relative level of spherical sphirot, and thereby only subject to divine providence on the group level. So in other words, the higher the integration, the more the details matter. the more details matter, the more direct divine supervision is going to be applied to the details.
Mhm. It means that also the person is once he's more supervised. Also, if he's doing good or bad, he'll be more affected by his
Yeah,
deeds.
it's true. That's true. That explains why God is stricter with the tzaddik.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that goes part of the way to explain why God
Mm.
is very strictly with the tzaddik and the saintly people, because they're more integrated entities.
Mhm.
Their deeds are more their divine soul, their animal souls are more integrated. The detail, the things of their lives are more integrated, and as a result of that higher level of integration, therefore, a little thing could set off the whole system on a much more profound level.
Mhm.
A slight, something that might be even a good deed for someone else might be considered sinful for them, because it's so much more sensitive, because every detail weighs more.
Mhm.
Yes, indeed.
So it seems that Jews get frustrated in the political world when Israel seems to be held up to a higher standard than the other countries, especially when they have to deal with such hate and evil. But
Yeah.
then it seems like what you're saying, since Jews have a higher number of mitzvot, there's more detail.
Right.
That God's self is holding Jews to a higher standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then why do we resent that we're being held to a higher standard?
Well, this, I don't want to really talk politics.
Well, I'm talking
That's
the
not my
concept,
thing,
the
but
concept.
okay, the concept, the way I understand it, is that most of those who are first thing is that non-Jews were also given 7 mitzvot.
Mhm. But that's a lot fewer number.
Right, the fewer number, but they were given 7 mitzvot: not to murder, not to steal, to have a fair system of justice is their mitzvah too. They have free choice in those areas.
Exactly, and that's how they bring sparks.
Right. Well, they don't. They pass sparks to us through that. We bring it up. They pass it on to us. It's like a soccer game. We're standing by the goal. We kick it into the goal, but they pass it downfield to us. They pass the ball downfield to us, so we could kick it into the goal. So
they're obligated to do that.
Right. They are obligated to keep the 7 Noahide commandments, and they don't have an excuse not to. They don't have an excuse for their anti-Semitism and for for any version of racism or something like that they practice, because it flies in. It could be shown that either it directly or aspects of it directly are outside the word and the spirit of the 7 Noahide laws. That's number one.
So then are Jews held to a higher standard by God in dealing with these nasty situations?
Right, but I have to also say, that traditionally religious Jews have taken the anti-Semitism as we are more responsible, because we are, you might say, the entity that's that is required to keep the more commandments, and we are. This is it goes back to integrated unity idea that we're mentioning here. That the details of what we do count more and have a bigger effect on the flow of blessing in the universe. And if they're not, and if because we're messing things up, they're not receiving their share of the blessing. So, we're not keeping the Torah. They're not receiving their share of the blessing properly. So as a result,
But the aspects of keeping Torah, rather than being ritual, but being things like how you treat your fellow man.
Everything is part of it. Everything is part of it. So,
but it seems difficult that it seems like sometimes the only path to peace is to be harsh with people who are harsh.
Yeah.
And therefore, how would Jews be held to a higher standard that way? It doesn't seem not only fair, but it also doesn't seem like it would lead to the end goal of peace.
So what I will say here Okay, if you want to talk more about it later in a different context, okay, I can. But what I'll say here uh, is that they have their 7 commandments that were given to them by God, and persecuting Jews is just for being Jews or just for trying to live by the Torah is a violation of the 7 commandments. Probably by the letter of the law, at the very least in the spirit of the law. Because they all know that they're supposed to have a fair system of justice. They all know they're not supposed to kill. They're not supposed to steal.
Mm-hmm.
They're not supposed to, they're not supposed to defame. They all know they're not supposed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that holds them responsible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, God did punish Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
God did punish Haman.
Mm-hmm.
So you look through the ages, those who persecuted the Jewish people, God did not turn away from them.
I'm looking forward to the day where this is in
Spain.
the past.
Spain
so
could have been a
look back
world.
on it.
Spain could have been a world power, but they expelled the Jews. They did not become a world power.
Mm-hmm.
So okay. So we'll leave the bookmark over here. Thank you for joining today. It was a pleasure, and I think we learned some interesting things today. Okay, Shavua Tov Varach. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
I guess we can stay here after all this. Thanks,
Wait. So I just click out. 1 second. So so just show me end stream.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Okay.